She once quoted a specific Bible verse to settle an argument with her 9-year-old son, a boy capable of dismantling her logic with actual physics if he wanted to, and she did it with total, unshakable certainty. Not because she believed Scripture could out-argue calculus, because certainty itself, any certainty, was the only thing standing between Mary Cooper and a home that felt like it could come apart at any moment. Mary Cooper never needed to be right about the Bible. She needed something in her house to be fixed and unchangeable. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to predict exactly which scripture she'll reach for in a crisis, and for years I saw Mary the same way most viewers do, the sweet, devout Texas mother trying to keep her genius son grounded in faith. But you don't just see a woman holding on to her religion out of simple devotion. You see someone gripping the one fixed point in a household full of things she couldn't control, a genius son she couldn't fully understand, a marriage quietly falling apart, a family that never entirely made sense to her. By the end of this video, every scripture Mary Cooper has ever quoted is going to sound a lot less like faith and a lot more like fear. There's a psychological pattern underneath what Mary does. When people face chronic uncertainty they can't resolve directly, they often gravitate toward rigid belief systems that offer clear, unchanging answers. Not because the answers are necessarily examined deeply, but because the certainty itself provides a sense of stability nothing else in their life can guarantee. It's a well-documented response to environments that feel unpredictable. Mary doesn't quote Scripture because she's incapable of nuance. She quotes it because absolute certainty is the one thing in her house that never shifts, never surprises her, and never requires her to sit with how little control she actually has over everything else. Sheldon's genius-level intellect presents Mary with a specific ongoing challenge. A child whose mind operates on a level she can't fully follow, whose questions about the universe, God, and existence itself often outpace her own theological framework entirely. Rather than simply admiring his intelligence, Mary frequently experiences it as destabilizing, a constant reminder that her son inhabits a way of understanding the world she may never fully access. Her response is rarely to engage Sheldon on his own intellectual terms. It's to reassert the fixed authority of her faith, treating Scripture as the trump card that doesn't require her to actually out-argue him. That's not simple stubbornness, it's self-protection. If Sheldon's logic could genuinely be examined and found more compelling than her beliefs, Mary would lose the one framework she trusts completely. In a household where nearly everything else already feels uncertain, that need for a fixed point becomes even more visible once you examine the marriage generating most of that underlying uncertainty in the first place. Mary's husband, George Sr., struggles visibly with alcohol throughout the series, working long hours as a high school football coach while quietly drinking to manage his own stresses and disappointments. Mary is aware of the drinking, addresses it periodically, but the marriage persists in a kind of uneasy equilibrium rather than open crisis, at least for most of the show's run. Living with an unpredictable, sometimes emotionally unavailable spouse creates exactly the kind of chronic instability that makes rigid certainty elsewhere so appealing. Mary can't control when George will be present, attentive, or sober. She can control, absolutely, what her faith teaches her about right and wrong, about God's plan, about the unchanging rules that govern a good life. That certainty becomes a counterweight to a marriage she can't fully stabilize through any other means available to her. That marriage and its particular instability comes to a devastating head later in the show in a way that tests everything Mary has built her worldview around. Later in the series, George has an affair, a rupture that shatters the fragile equilibrium Mary had maintained for years. Her response combines genuine grief with a desperate reassertion of her religious framework, treating the crisis as something her faith must help her process and ultimately forgive, rather than something that might require reconsidering the marriage itself more fundamentally. That response isn't weakness. It's Mary reaching for the only tool she's ever fully trusted during genuine crisis. Her religious framework doesn't just offer comfort, it offers a script, forgiveness, redemption, staying the course, that spares her from having to build an entirely new understanding of her marriage and her life from scratch. during the most destabilizing moment she's faced as an adult. That same instinct, reaching for certainty rather than reconstruction, shapes how she handles her children too, particularly the daughter who increasingly resents living in her genius brother's shadow. Mary's daughter, Missy, grows up constantly overshadowed by Sheldon's genius, a dynamic Mary herself contributes to, however unintentionally, by directing so much of her attention and anxiety toward managing her more complicated son. Missy's resentment builds steadily throughout the series, rarely fully addressed by either parent. Mary's rigid faith framework offers a specific, if inadequate, way of managing this imbalance, treating everyone's role in the family as part of God's larger plan. Rather than examining the concrete inequities of attention and resources Missy actually experiences daily. It's easier to tell Missy that everyone has their own purpose than to sit with the harder truth that Sheldon's needs have genuinely consumed more of the household's emotional bandwidth for years. That same pattern, faith as an explanation that forecloses harder examination, plays out again with her older son, whose more ordinary struggles rarely receive the same attention Sheldon's exceptional ones do. Mary's oldest son, Georgie, drops out of school to help support the family financially, taking on adult responsibilities considerably earlier than typical for someone his age. Mary's response is often more practical than emotionally attentive, treating his sacrifices as expected rather than examining what they might be costing him developmentally. That gap in attention isn't cruelty, it's triage. With Sheldon requiring constant intellectual and social management, and George's drinking creating its own instability, Mary simply has less bandwidth left for Georgie's quieter, more conventional struggles. Her faith occasionally supplies the language to frame his sacrifices as noble and necessary, a family duty blessed by God, rather than fully reckoning with how much of his own adolescence he's giving up. That tendency to lean on faith rather than deeper emotional examination becomes clearest of all in her relationship with her own mother, whose entirely different worldview offers a striking contrast. Mary's own mother, Connie, known as Meemaw, is considerably more secular, unconventional, and comfortable with ambiguity than her daughter, running a bar out of her home and maintaining relationships and lifestyle choices Mary's church community would likely judge harshly. Their relationship carries real affection alongside real tension, two women who clearly love each other while holding almost opposite worldviews. That contrast reveals something important. Mary's rigid religiosity isn't simply inherited wholesale from her upbringing. In some ways, it's a reaction against it, an attempt to build a more stable, more clearly defined framework than the one she grew up inside, which apparently offered considerably more improvisation and considerably less certainty than Mary found comfortable as an adult raising her own family. That reactive rigidity, building fixed rules, specifically because her own childhood offered so few, connects directly to a broader cultural environment that rewarded exactly this kind of religious certainty. Mary's involvement with her local church community and her relationship with Pastor Jeff specifically provides her with a consistent social structure and sense of belonging that extends well beyond private belief. The church offers Mary something her home life often can't, a space where the rules are clear, where her role is well defined, and where certainty is not just tolerated but actively celebrated as a virtue. That community reinforcement matters. Mary's rigidity isn't maintained in isolation. It's constantly validated by an entire social structure that treats her particular brand of certainty as spiritually admirable rather than psychologically protective. Losing standing in that community, or being seen to waver in her faith, would cost her more than private doubt. It would cost her one of the few consistently stable, predictable relationships in her entire life. That community's broader cultural context deserves closer examination on its own, because it shaped far more than Mary's private beliefs. To understand Mary fully, it helps to understand the specific religious culture of East Texas during the era the show depicts. The Bible Belt of the 1980s and 1990s offered women like Mary a clearly defined, socially reinforced role, deeply devout, family-centered, finding meaning and community primarily through church involvement, in a culture that treated religious certainty as a marker of moral character rather than a coping strategy worth examining. That cultural framework gave Mary's personal need for stability a respectable, even celebrated, outlet. Her rigidity wasn't read by her community as anxiety. It was read as faithfulness, a virtue actively encouraged by the culture around her, one that offered little space for public doubt or theological flexibility, especially for women whose primary social role centered on family and church. That regional religious culture explains why Mary's coping mechanism took the specific shape it did, rather than manifesting as some other, less socially rewarded form of rigidity. There's a second layer of context worth examining. Mid to late 20th century evangelical culture in the American South often placed enormous value on women's roles as devoted wives and mothers specifically, with personal identity and worth closely tied to the family's spiritual and domestic stability, considerably more than to independent achievement or identity outside those roles. For a woman raised within that framework, a marriage destabilized by drinking and infidelity, and a household containing a child whose genius challenges her own worldview daily, represents a genuine threat to the primary source of meaning that culture taught her to invest in. Her rigid faith isn't just personal comfort. It's the last line of defense protecting an identity her culture told her was supposed to be her whole purpose. That inherited framework explains why Mary clings to certainty so tightly, even as her actual circumstances keep providing evidence that certainty alone can't fully protect her family from real instability. Dr. Sturgis, an atheist physicist who becomes an unlikely mentor to Sheldon and eventually a close family friend, represents everything Mary's worldview is built in opposition to: intellectual skepticism, comfort with uncertainty, and a life built without religious framework at all. Their relationship develops slowly from wariness into genuine affection and respect, despite their fundamentally opposed worldviews. That friendship matters because it shows Mary capable of genuine connection across exactly the kind of difference her rigidity might be expected to reject outright. She doesn't need Sturgis to convert, and notably, doesn't try particularly hard to convert him either. Their bond suggests that underneath her need for certainty, Mary retains a capacity for accepting people as they are, one that occasionally exceeds what her theology alone would predict. Mary's relationship with her neighbor Brenda Sparks, a more permissive, less conventionally religious mother, offers a recurring source of both comedy and genuine friction throughout the series. Mary often judges Brenda's parenting choices and lifestyle, while Brenda pushes back against Mary's rigidity with her own blunt, unapologetic worldview. That ongoing tension functions as a kind of mirror for Mary, a visible alternative to her own tightly controlled approach to parenting and faith, one that occasionally reveals genuine warmth and effectiveness despite lacking Mary's structure entirely. Their friendship, complicated as it is, suggests that Mary is at least occasionally capable of recognizing value in an approach fundamentally different from her own, even when she can't fully embrace it herself. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. George Sr., the one everyone frames as the unreliable husband whose drinking and infidelity destabilized the family Mary worked so hard to hold together, he's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who relied just as heavily on Mary's rigid certainty as she relied on it herself, using her unwavering structure as permission to avoid confronting his own struggles directly. Think about it. George rarely has to build his own coping mechanism for the family's instability, because Mary's faith-based framework consistently absorbs the emotional weight of holding everything together. Her certainty doesn't just stabilize her, it stabilizes the entire household around her, quietly permitting George to keep drinking, keep avoiding, keep failing to fully show up, because Mary's rigid structure will keep the family functioning, regardless of what he does or doesn't address in himself. So the husband everyone assumes was simply the source of the family's instability turns out to have been quietly depending on his wife's certainty to paper over his own avoidance, letting her carry the full weight of keeping everyone together, while he never had to build any comparable stability of his own. What Mary deserved, in a marriage that kept destabilizing beneath her, and a household containing a mind she could never fully reach, was proof that she didn't have to hold everything together entirely alone. Not a scripture reached for the instant uncertainty crept in, not a fixed, unchanging framework built to withstand a marriage and a family that kept shifting anyway. What she actually received was an entire culture and a life that handed her the full weight of the family's stability and called it devotion. So she gripped certainty tighter, because it was the only thing that never once let her down the way everything else eventually did. She built an entire faith into a fortress, so nothing else falling apart could reach the parts of her that were already so tired of holding on. She built it so well, she rarely let herself notice how exhausting it was to be the only fixed point in an entire family's chaos. And in her friendship with a man whose entire worldview rejected her own, in her quiet acceptance of a neighbor who lived nothing like she did, that was the woman still holding everything up, finally quietly, allowing herself a little room to simply be uncertain too. The scripture was never about the scripture. It never was. So was Mary Cooper simply devout, or a woman terrified of what happens without certainty to hold on to? Neither, honestly. Mary wasn't a naturally rigid woman who happened to be religious, and she wasn't a frightened woman merely performing faith for effect. She was someone who turned an unstable marriage, an ungraspable son, and an entire culture that handed her sole responsibility for the family's stability into an unshakable certainty, because it was the only ground that never once moved beneath her feet. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person holding the tightest to their beliefs isn't avoiding doubt out of arrogance. She's just protecting herself from a life that's already given her more uncertainty than she knows how to safely hold. So here's what I want to know. If Mary's marriage had been stable from the start, do you think she still becomes a woman who needs absolute religious certainty to feel safe? Or was that need always going to find her somewhere, given the culture and household that raised her? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.